I'm Marvin, and I'm making a 3D platform about a small rock that can manipulate time. In the last devlog I focused on setting up the project and character movement, like jumping, rolling, and leaping. The focus for this month is game visuals and environment. Okay, I need to decide on an art style. Currently objects have only one color and no texture on them. And this is a problem. You can't tell where one object ends and another begins, which is pretty game breaking in a platformer. So I need the environments to be very, very clear. I searched for a simple solution at first, which contained some different shaders. I tried an edge detection shader, which makes an outline on the outer edges of objects, and it fixed the problem of unclear terrain, but it didn't really look that well. I also tried a pixel art shader, which looked pretty cool and reminded me of the game A Short Hike, but it didn't really fit the game. So I decided that I would give hand painting textures a go. I researched and found out that Procreate, an app for the iPad, has a feature to texture 3D models. So I wanted to test it and imported a very simple rock model that I made. You have to know, I've never done this before. I can't really draw, so I wanted to make some simple shapes at first. So I played around with some brushes and just drew onto the rock with a dark color. I did this for multiple layers, so I would have the ability to decide which layers work the best in the end, and with that I had the option to reduce the opacity of some shapes that I drew later on. And I really liked the workflow of directly drawing onto a 3D object and seeing it in real time, so I imported it, and I think it doesn't look that bad for my first attempt. And then I wanted to test more features, but this time I would do it differently. I wanted to make some floor textures, so I didn't need the ability to see 3D objects, but I needed a texture that I can put on any object I want and maybe control the opacity of my drawing in the engine. So I made a bunch of variations of different shapes and different sizes, and I had to make sure that they all loop seamlessly, otherwise you would see where the texture ends and begins on an object, which doesn't really look that nice. And I'll show you how they turned out in-game later in the first level, because that's exactly what I did next. Okay, I wanted to make the first level or the tutorial area for the game, so I modeled the bare minimum of 3D objects, like decor rocks, walls and small platforms, and I started layouting the area from a top-down view. And I always went in-game and ran and jumped around to test the sizes. After the layout was kind of complete, I modeled some torches for the floor and some to be used on the wall, and I gave them a small light source, which made the environment a little bit more cozy, so nothing fancy about that. Now that the cave was in a pretty okay state, I tested the different floor textures, and I think they work pretty good for now. They're very stylized, so I think I can get away with using them for different materials like rocks, grass or mountains. But right now, if I want to change a small thing in the texture, I have to go back into Procreate and do the whole process of exporting and importing again. That's why in the future I want to make a shader where I can decide on the opacity of the shapes and the noise of the texture. But I don't really need it right away, so I'll do it in the future. When I ran around the level, I began having issues with the camera. Because I tested with gamepad, I always had to reposition my camera with the right stick, and I know that this isn't a method that everyone uses, so I researched how other games did this. In Mario Odyssey, for example, Nintendo made a simple system for this issue. When you're running left in Mario Odyssey, your camera rotates to the left as well. And the same goes for the right direction, of course. So it's pretty simple, so I implemented exactly that. This gameplay shows how the camera behaves if you play with a gamepad and don't touch the right stick. And I also made it so that the camera does not focus on Pebble's position exactly, but rather a little bit in front of him, so the player can see more of where they are currently moving to. And I added a toggleable option for this follow cam called camera help. One of the main features in the game is reversing and advancing objects through time to use them as platforms or to solve puzzles. And I had a very basic system where the player had to slot a crystal inside an object, and it just moved the object between location A and B, so it took the shortest route for that. I could do it for the position of the object and the rotation of the object. And now I reworked the system so that I can have a curve for one object, so it doesn't take the shortest route from A to B, but rather moves along a predefined path. And this works with rotation and position as well. Lore-wise, I think of these objects as glitches in the world where time doesn't properly work, so I called them time splinters or splinter components in engine. I also made a splinter area system where multiple splinters are attached to one splinter area, so the player can enter the area and reverse and advance multiple objects through time at once. Before you could only move one object at a time. And now I can make things like maybe 5 or 10 or 50 different objects that move through time based on your input. I added visuals for that as well, so the player can see in-game where a splinter area is. And I was inspired by the Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild shrines, but I didn't really make a good job with copying them. But in the future I will tweak it so it looks better than now. After that was done, I began implementing a brand new gameplay feature, which is splinters that toggle between two locations. It's basically the same system as splinters with a green crystal, but splinters with a blue crystal can't be stopped in between point A and B. So they are either in point A or in point B. And the player doesn't need to slot in a crystal, but they have to hold a blue crystal in order for the objects to be moved. I have a couple ideas for that, for example bridges or platforms that build themselves when you come close. And I can use this for platform timing challenges or some escape sequences where you have to quickly run away from something. And I made it so that the system works exactly the same way like it did with the green crystals. So it's very modular in that case. Speaking of crystals, Pebble can now only hold one crystal at a time. He could hold 5 crystals before, because some splinter objects needed different amounts of crystals to be moved through time, but that didn't really make for a better gameplay experience and was almost only busy work for the player, so I cut it for now and limited it to 1 crystal. Playtesting will show if this will be a good or a bad thing though. I made it so that the crystals can be slotted back in a crystal spot as well. I also made a very simple button prompt system, so at objects that the player can interact with, a little image floats above them, and it tells you what button you have to press in order to interact with it. So right now it detects what input device the player is currently using, so if they change from keyboard to gamepad for example, it will always show the correct button. But it's not very modular right now, it doesn't allow for button remapping. That's a thing that I will implement at a later time. I don't really need it right away. I also made a bunch of small other stuff as well, like a debug menu for quickly adding or removing crystals, or teleporting the player, or changing the speed of the game to test animations in slow motion for example. I also tweaked the jump shadow system a bit, so the circle shadow beneath Pebble grows or shrinks in size depending on how far away Pebble is from the ground. And I made a fade texture where when you die there's a small cartoony animation which masks the screen with an image of Pebble's silhouette. And I was making and cutting the first devlog this month. I also hung up a poster from my last game, Tainted Treasure, in my room. It looks beautiful, I know. But the most important thing I did was making the Steam page. I had to make many images and logo variations in order for Steam to be happy, and I also researched a lot and began working on the description of the Steam page. Okay, if you like this devlog, I'd really appreciate it if you wishlisted Pebble on Steam, and maybe send it to a friend where you know they will like it. Let me know what you want to see more of in the next devlog. My plans contain reworking the rolling and leaping mechanic, and working on concept, because I don't have a clear goal for the first level yet. I have a bunch of ideas written down, but I really need to focus and decide on one area. Okay, that's it for now. I'll see you in the next devlog.